going to move on because this panel shows up again. So, as I was saying, my name is Eve Faulkes. I don't think I've said that yet, but my name is Eve Faulkes. And I was the coordinator of graphic design at West Virginia University for 42 years. Actually, I wasn't the coordinator all 42 years, but I was there that long. And I just told you I'm a designer, so you might wonder why there are some particularly, maybe a poor choice of font for my name. And if you haven't seen it before, that is an actual font called Ugly Jerry. And every letter in it is a gerrymandered district, an actual gerrymandered district. And I particularly like the A, which has a complete hole in the middle where they just left some people entirely out. So those are the kind of things that make us stop and think. And when I was a designer, a teaching designer, I had a course for about 10 years that was designed for social impact, and we dealt with trying to figure out how do we do human-centered design where we're really trying to ask questions and create things that aren't just pretty, but able to convey something and make people think. And we would often ask questions like this: how might we create an environment where people have a personal experience with one another to dispel stereotypes? So that might be the beginning of a project. And this particular project was a mural on the Health Right free clinic in Morgantown. And it is called Ways of Caring, and it was depicting people who had different ways of leading and doing something important there. And so we have John Garlow, who was John Garlow Sr., there's a junior in town now, but he was actually a mental health patient, and when lithium came around, he became an advocate and actually got the Clifford Beers Award from Rosalind Carter for doing things like starting a friendship house, which is a drop-in center. That's way too much information. And then Yasmin Mustafa, who helped start the Interfaith organization in Morgantown, and Charlene Marshall on the right, who was the first black mayor in West Virginia. And what was cool about that, cooler than the fact that we did that, was who did it. So what we did is we invited people to help us make the mural. We had kind of a paint by dot instead of paint by number, and there were dots, and we had ladders, and we had people who were my class. We had the LGBT pride officers, we had the Muslim Student Association, we had homeless people, the mayor, businessmen, and a zombie. This particular picture was taken when there was a Halloween parade, so the zombie joined us. But getting people, the coolest thing about that was that there's a homeless person painting beside a Muslim woman, and the homeless guy had been a painter anyway, and he came to me later and he said, I just had the best conversation I've ever had with someone, and that's what we were hoping to do. And that little note on the right hand was we invited everybody who was part of this mural to come have a big community dinner together later. Another thing my students and I did was put on a couple of conferences that were called Designing Across Divides, and we would invite people who were doing successful things across the country to come do a lecture in the morning, and then in the afternoon there were workshops, and all the people who were part of the workshop would, am I going off and on? Am I holding it wrong? One moment, please. So just like the mural, we invited people to be the attendees at this conference who were from all walks of life. We had people from the police department, we had homeless folks, we had the whole gamut. every kind of opposite divide we invited to see if they could cross the divide with some of these methods. The city collaborated with us on the one in 2019 and gave us all the lampposts in town, and they were divided, so we made we had a poster contest across the U.S., and we got some international contributions as well. And the idea was that you had to design something that would only work when it crossed that divide where the pole was. And the one on the left is from Yossi Lemel, who lives in Tel Aviv, and he's an international poster artist. And he'd been a speaker at our first conference, so he was on board with us, and he contributed that one on the left. And then on the right was one of my students. A smile goes a long way. And you can see those little figures there, and she was from Bahrain. Another very cool project we were able to do in this course, a lot of times we were working with nonprofits that were local, but sometimes we would get something really cool like this international project. And we were able to brand this international collaborative that was agricultural, and they were bringing solar-powered and refrigeration technology from Israel to Palestine, and the Palestinians were able to grow the date farms and the greenhouses and things. And we branded it, that was the BIP up there, and then we made the packaging for their first product that was brought over to the U.S., and it was going to be marketed through Catholic schools. So we had Catholics, Muslims, and Jewish folks working together. Something you would never think of doing right now. And then when I retired, of course I lost my army of students to do things with, but the benefit of that was I wasn't censored in any way, and I could do what I wanted to do that the university as a 501c3 could not always let me do. So the problems were still there. And one of the problems I've already heard some conversation about, the legislature has raised bills that might ban books or ban the teaching of history. And so I was retired, and a bunch of other people I knew that were retired, and some of them had good connections, and we had more time. So we formed this organization, this 501c4, that could lobby. And it was called the West Virginia Coalition for Truth in History. It's still around, and you can still join. We got 28 counties and 330 people joining. And what we did with that was talk to one another, of course. And we made this statement that went out as a full-page ad in the Gazette newspaper during the legislature when this was coming up. And I shook it at them and told them what we thought, and that we were older, we had time, and we could come, and we had money, and we were going to do something. And then another thing, I'm still asking these questions, always similar to when the students were there. How might we create more environments where people have a personal experience with one another to dispel stereotypes or racism or misogyny or any other thing like that? And one idea we had, Susan Easton and I had this idea of doing one-on-one listening experiences, because personal experiences are where you can refute the things you've just read on media. And we called it Listening for Racial Understanding, and this is part of a video. And what we did is we invited, through an ad in the newspaper, we invited people to come and sit with someone of another race, and it would be private, and you could have this conversation, and if you wanted, we would record it, but if you wanted, we would let it become public. And the way it became public was by, these were the 23 pairs of people who were our participants. And we paired them with an artist. We had half white, half black artists that were willing to do that. The artist would listen to the recording and then capture some part of it to make a piece of art. And this is one pair of people. Deidre on the left is a trans woman, and Yasmin Mustafa was in that mural that we had done earlier. And I knew Yasmin was going to love her, but she didn't know that. Deidre didn't know that. And so they answered our prompts and went through the whole thing. And when they got done, Deidre says, well, I have to tell you, I'm a trans woman. And Yasmin says, oh, I knew that. Then they did it all over. And then it was a much more vibrant conversation. So this was the piece that came out of that. And I wish I had time to tell you more about this project, because it made people cry. But these art pieces were then exhibited across the state. It travels around. It's still available to travel. And there were these tags on the side of the art pieces that had pictures of the people who were in the conversation, the artists who had done it. And there's also a QR code that lets people hear snippets of the conversation. And there's also a website that you can hear those things on. As it traveled, if it was in an area where some of the participants were, they would usually come and be part of the opening and talk about what the experience was like for them. So that brings us to today. And the question to ask now is, how might we help each other understand just how important community engagement is in preparing for this election? And working with me on this project is the Community Coalition for Social Justice. And there were some other collaborators on that too that were helping with funding. And if you weren't able to see it, and these are about real size to the panels that are upstairs. The one, the next one's coming up. But the way I wanted to start telling people about the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act is why we needed it. And I thought maybe people would not know what the difference was between human rights and civil rights. And so that's the way it gets introduced. And you might recognize Eleanor Roosevelt up there, and her role for a woman was phenomenal, to be the person who was able to organize the UN to agree. I think it was 153 nations that agreed on these 30 universal human rights, which was very cool. But then without civil rights, it means nothing. It's just nice. So civil rights are explained there, and Herbert Henderson was a lawyer in Huntington who helped with his cases to get Marshall University integrated. In the middle is after the Civil Rights Act of '64 was passed, there was still more to do, and the impact of it was to pass the Voting Rights Act, and also the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and also a number of other things that we know about, like the interracial marriage, and Roe was one to get abortion rights. And these green ones are things that we won from that as victories. And then, of course, marriage equality for same-sex marriage. And then on the right, in red, are things we have lost since this time. We know we've turned over Roe v. Wade. We've also gutted a lot of the Voting Rights Act. And things are still happening even during this election cycle that kind of take us away from that. The third panel is what the Civil Rights actually says in its language. And then on the West Virginia silhouette there, you see what West Virginia's Constitution has for that. And it actually happened in 1961, and we were covering a little bit more than the Civil Rights Act was. In those red circles is kind of a timeline of like the rights that we first had and how they got bigger and bigger as we got closer. And there's also language in there about the Crown Act and the fact that Wheeling and Morgantown and Lewisburg and Beckley have passed the Crown Act, but the state has not. And so that's one we're still trying to do. 22 states have passed it, but we're not one of those. I'll go back just a second. So this little square right here you can't see very well, but it's on the Universal Human Rights section of that panel. And I wanted to talk about that because a really wonderful friend of mine, who's another internationally famous artist who's come to WVU several times. Chaz Maviani Davies was asked to, I forget when it was, I think it was in the 90s maybe, he was asked to make illustrations of each of those universal human rights. And this is Article 1, no one shall be subjected to slavery or servitude. But he's just a really great metaphor maker, and what tremendous, is just one of the most powerful posters I've ever seen. And he gave me permission to use it, which is why I'm talking about it here, because this kind of thing is only possible by having relationships with people or starting them and having common passion. And the one that was in the middle of the last slide, the two hands that are collaborating there, those are two friends of mine. And so we originally took pictures like this, and eventually we got to one that looked like a heart, and that was the one that we ended up using there. So that's how that was generated. And here are the three other ones. And there's where I was telling you would see Alvin Ailey. When I was at RISD, I was exposed to Alvin Ailey, and I hadn't realized at the time how early it was part of the civil rights movement. But anyway, this dancer that's representing the Black Arts Movement, and Tar Beach, which you probably have in your library, a children's book by a famous painter, sculptor, Faith Ringgold. And then these other faces that are on the left and right columns are people, some of them are people that older folks will recognize, and some of them were picked out by the WVU NAACP officers who were my advisors on this, because I really wanted to attract that generation. And so it represents the ceiling breakers, and upstairs you would see that a lot of those panels with the pictures on them will open, and you can read more of their bio. Same with the one that has the freedom movement. And so some of those people are, I forgot what I was going to say there. In the background is Ella Baker, who was a famous early civil rights leader. And of course, I put John R. Lewis in there because of the Voting Rights Act reboot that is trying to be passed. And I wanted to point out, again, this collaboration idea, because this dancer was in, I think it was 1959 when this picture was taken, and it was a performance that they still do in New York, and it's a powerful dance set to spirituals, gospel and blues, and it's about the depiction of slavery, which isn't entirely obvious unless you're really focused on it. In the last one, some of you might have recognized, I don't know if I gave you time or that you could see the picture, but Rita Moreno was in there, who was the brown person that I have there. But I wanted to show you that she was one of the stars in West Side Story, and the remake may be on Broadway already, but the 50-year remake, she's still in it as another person, another character. And this beautiful portrait of John R. Lewis was done by Rebecca Hale, who's a National Geographic photographer. And this would have cost me $500 from National Geographic, but I found her as the photographer, wrote her, told her about the project. She said, "You can use it." And she gave me the high-res photo that could be enlarged. So I'm very grateful for people who share the passion. So this is what it looks like if you haven't seen it. And the 6 panels often can be formed into triangles, or they're just single panels, so they've been able to move around a lot. And they've been in a bunch of places, libraries like this, churches, colleges, festivals. I made a special set of outdoor uh, ways to keep weather out of them. And again, just like in the Listening for the Racial Understanding Project, if someone's around who's interested in it or has been part of it, they will often speak at these kinds of events. And this was an outdoor festival, Multi-Fest in Charleston. And I didn't point out on the Freedom Riders, that's what I was about to do and forgot, but there was a 21-year-old Joan Browning, who was one of the 9 white women Freedom Riders. And she's still with us, and she's lives in Lewisburg, and she'll come to any of these that, she's in a conference in Kansas City right now, or she would have been here tonight, but she was in Multi-Fest, and she was able to meet up with Doug Amar, and they had this amazing conversation, and she had other conversations with anybody else who would walk by, and her story is pretty fantastic. So I'm not going to use this slide, but it's all the places it's been so far up to tonight. Sometimes we'll do another thing with it. I have a series of half-size posters that can just be background for this event that's like a listening event, like the Racial Understanding one. And this one happened in the farmers market in Morgantown. And you can see people are paired up, so it's not as private, but it still works. You might recognize Barb Howe in that picture. A third leg of this project is the graphic novel that's upstairs, and this is what it looks like. So it's about to be, it's at the press now, and the reason for a graphic novel is that, again, I wanted to get this younger audience, and it also is so that people who don't want to read a whole book get a lot of pictures. And so this was some of my research, seeing what, because I grew up with comic books and a graphic novel's different, so I had to figure out what that means. And the top row are ones that are historic graphic novels, just like what I wanted to do. And the bottom row are 3 books in a trilogy called March that are about John R. Lewis's experience. And they were designed by Nate Powell, who happened to be one of the visiting artists at WVU's Art Museum during the time I needed him. And so I was part of his workshop, and then he became, he endorsed our book. So that was a beautiful collaboration too. These are some of the, just when I was searching, this is what a graphic novel looks like at some time. So they don't have to be color anymore. They might still use cells. They don't even have to be all drawings anymore. Sometimes they use collages or photography. And in the one Nate Powell did, March, there's a little bit of each. So there's still some recognizable speech bubbles, and sometimes it's a full bleed drawing. They don't have to be contained within cells. So I felt freed up to go do something. And so this, again, is our graphic novel. And what we chose to do, again, we put ads out in the paper, and I went to Black Policy Day, and I went everywhere I could think of that people might have stories or tell me who I needed to interview. We ended up interviewing about 25 people, and here are some of the people whose stories are captured in the graphic novel. I don't know if anyone knows Ron English from Charleston. You see Joan there. The age range is 20 to 100, so the 100-year-old Sarah Little is one of our people talking. And so the stories are divided into chapters, and the first chapter is a black man and a white man, both in their 80s. Both happened to be at the March on Washington in 1963, though they did not know each other at that time. And after that, chapter 2 is about people who are actually in the freedom movement, and that includes Ken Heckler, who you may or may not know was in the Selma March, and lived to be 102, got married for the first time at 96. And at 96, he was still chaining himself to trees to protest mountaintop removal. And chapter 3 contains other people who may not have been included in when you just think of the black and white sense of discrimination, but everyone from LGBT to people with disabilities to women. And there's also, I'm not sure exactly why we put it in that category, but the Green Book story is in there too, and Native Americans. Oh, I forgot to say 4. So chapter 4 is about the helpers. It's kind of the allies. And the allies, it goes both ways. Sometimes it's white people who facilitated black people, and sometimes it's the other. So there's Barb Howe, who was our editor, Joan Browning, our editor, and Don Spencer, who was one of our researchers. I just got a message that I have to plug in. Have I got a plug real close to me? I do. Okay. All right. Excuse me just 1 minute. We're good. What's taken so long is that we also went through Populor, which is a printing services group in Morgantown, to make sure there is absolutely no error in the whole book. So that took as long as it did to make the whole book almost. And it's going to be printed at the HBCU, West Virginia State University, that has a good printing department. So these are those WVU officers of the NAACP chapter that I was telling you about. So they were advising me on some of the folks that I needed to include in the Black Arts Movement and the people they revered, like Ta-Nehisi Coates. Did I get that right? Okay. And I didn't know who that was, but that was a graphic novelist who, and some, anyway, I'm going to move on. So this is what they look like as they're telling their story in the book. And Sierra Boggs is from Spencer, West Virginia, and Dana Pratt, who's the president of the organization, is from the Bahamas, and so they tell stories about that. And among their other stories, they collaborate on why we need the Crown Act, and they really describe to readers what the differences are in the hairstyles that are cultural to them, and how much time and how much money it takes to get those, and why it's such a tragedy, not only in embarrassment and humiliation when they're asked to go change their hair and make it more like a white person's hair, but also how much money and investment, is lost in that. So I thought it was a really wonderful way they tell that story. So I'm just going to skip around. It's a 128-page book, so there's no way to tell you too much about it. But I would have a different kind of general look on thumbnails of different stories to make them distinct, even though they're held together by being these black and white drawings. This is Al Anderson, who lives in Osage, West Virginia, and he's 87. He's the first person in the book, and I'll just quickly go through some of his. I put him first because he happened to be in the right place at the right time for a moment in history a lot of times. And I started out his chapter by a moment of his when he had been on the Mall in Washington, and he also had become friends with Roberta Flack. I don't know why I couldn't think of her name. The first time ever I saw your face. Um, and yet, then we jump back to when he grew up as a kid, and he did the things that black kids were allowed to do, which was shine shoes. And he started that at age 11. And yet he lived in Osage, which was one of 13 coal camps that had attracted people from 23 countries, as well as the Great Migration from the South, as well as the white farmers that were there before the coal was found. And they all lived together, poor, but needing to help each other, and they adopted each other's kids regardless of color when there was a disaster, and still have, they were integrated before that was a word. But when he is in high school and joins the Army in 1955, not only is that right when Emmett Till is murdered, but it's also when he first experiences racism in South Carolina when his he's let off the base to go to town, and he hears a black band playing. They're going to go in and hear a black band play, but they're chased right out. And he was also in Morgantown when the first black football players were allowed into WVU, and at that time they could only eat in Osage and not Morgantown. So Morgantown was segregated, Osage was not. He also gets a call from the sheriff one day and thinks he's in big trouble, but the sheriff actually wants him to be a lead singer in his son's all-white rock and roll band, and that sets him on a different kind of adventure. He ends up being the singer on What Do You Do on New Year's Eve, and gets some fame there. But so he's in California when the Watts riot happens. He's in, again, he was in the March in Washington where he worked and played music for 20 years before moving back to town. And then he talks about his community now and how it's still doing some great things. And he has a podcast. The white person that was in that second story also was involved in civil rights in a different way. He was born in Paden City, West Virginia, and then when he went to graduate school in Delaware, he realized that other members of his graduate program were from other countries and were black, and they weren't allowed to go where he was allowed to go. So they all made a new organization called SCAD, which was Student Coalition Against Discrimination. And they got so much done that they attracted the attention of SNCC down in Atlanta, and one of the SNCC field representatives, Hank Thomas, was sent up to help them do this. And Hank Thomas is the guy who is in the front of the picture of the burning bus that was on the Freedom Rides. And so he has some adventures he shares with Hank. And then one other person that he was really impressed with was George Wilson, who was the first black city councilman in their city in Delaware. And they knew about this SCAD group and were, what was really wonderful about George Wilson to Dwayne Nichols, who's the white man, was that he was on the city council, but his work was in demolition. And as he demolished buildings, he would save the parts and ended up building 51 homes for people in the black community. So as that was going on, he and his son one time went to a restaurant to get served and couldn't, and then they called Dwayne and that organization. They came there and they turned the lights out on him, but they sat there for so long that they ended up integrating the restaurant. And so stuff like that happens. Ron English had a cool way of getting into West Virginia. There was a church on Shrewsbury Street in Charleston where Martin Luther King had once preached, the only place in West Virginia he ever did preach. And a parishioner there called Martin Luther King Sr. to see if they had anybody who might be willing to come up and take on their church, and it ended up being Ron English. So that's why it says Daddy King sent me. And he's got a really cool story there of his experiences that were different in encountering a state police in Georgia and in West Virginia. So in Georgia, he was coming home from a shift at work one time and got pulled over knowing he hadn't done anything wrong. There was nothing wrong with his license, and he asked the police officer, "Why did you pull me over?" And he says, "N-word, I don't need a reason to pull you over or take you to jail," and that's what he did. So he was arrested, put in jail for nothing. And then when Reverend Ron was in West Virginia, he was coming from Pittsburgh where he'd taken his family to visit relatives, and it got dark and he'd forgotten to fill up with gas in Pittsburgh. And so worriedly, he pulls over to the state police thing, hoping not to be noticed, and the officer comes out and says, "How can I help you?" And he tells what his story is. He's out of gas, hoping to wait till morning when the stations might be open. And the policeman says, "Well, I know Earl down the street, at the next exit. I'm going to call him, tell him to open up early for you, and I'm going to escort you to that place." And he did that. And so that was the difference between Georgia and West Virginia for his experience. So there's stuff like that happening. This is a time when I'm combining a photograph with a drawing, because you'd never get that much detail in a drawing. But that's when the Triangle District in Charleston was being torn down, and protests about that. And then he also had the opportunity to travel to South Africa and meet Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu because of the reconciliation. It was one, and I think it was right after Nelson Mandela was released. So I'm going to skip around because I want to, there's obviously, I've just got a lot of things that I could show you, but I want to keep you awake. These are two Freedom Riders, Joan when she was 21, and Winston Fuller, who was a poetry professor at WVU. And both of them were put in jail. Joan was in jail when a week before Martin Luther King was in, and that was in Albany. And then Winston Fuller had been a graduate student at UCLA, and when he heard about the Freedom Rides, he joined up and was arrested and put in the Parchman Penitentiary in Mississippi. And when he got out, he didn't talk much about it because he got his job at WVU without notifying anybody that he had this felony, until 5 years later when the hearing came up and he was exonerated. This is a story about a West Virginian who is one of the Tuskegee Airmen, a mechanic, and when he comes back, because of the double victory kind of thing, you had to be fighting the war abroad and at home, because when he got home, he was not able to get a job as a mechanic, even though he was a very good one. But when he was 96, he finally got a Congressional Medal of Honor. This is a story about both someone who's a helper and learned that from experience with black people helping. So when she was a little kid, actually before she was born, she knew about this story of her father, who had been in a coal mine just like right out of high school and had his legs crushed. And they didn't have appropriate tourniquets or medical ways to take care of him, and so they rushed him in this 1916 car to the nearest house, which happened to be where a black family lived, and they rushed out, applied tourniquets, wrapped him up, and he went on to Grafton, and his life was saved, but he had wooden legs after that. And he still was a sheep farmer and managed. That's Rita telling the story over on the right. And when she was in high school, um, she'd been huge in 4-H all her life, but she got her teaching certificate and moved to New Jersey. And the place that she was teaching was a black high school. And she found this great apartment that wasn't very expensive, but it turned out she didn't know it was in the prostitution district. And so her students didn't tell her what they were doing, but they walked her home every day, and she figured it out pretty soon. And then she moved to another place where she was in a duplex with 2 people who were very generous. And this was during the time in the early 60s when the UN was starting to get African countries, their leadership was winning, and they were trying to decide what were they going to be. What were they going to be, a democracy or a communist or whatever? And they weren't, because they were black, they weren't allowed to stay in any of the hotels. So this duplex became a place that they stayed. And so Rita learned about generosity from them. And the reason they did that is because their parents were missionaries in Burma. And so they were missionaries that were the kind, we used to call him Johnny Appleseed for the peace movement. He approached everyone as a child of God. Race was no barrier, nor was nationality, nor was religion, nor was lack of religion. And so they were doing the same things there. So this is like several generations of teaching this kind of thinking. Oh, I was just going to show you, those are the real people that were the missionaries. And then sometimes I would use AI to try and just do some research about like what would a Burma person in that generation look like. And so that ended up being the drawing that went with it. But then sometimes you ask AI to do something and you get really crazy stuff. So they literally put the cart before the horse when I was trying to do that. So the drawing I ended up with over there, so I was glad to see what the jacket looked like. I didn't say why I had that one in there. So the reason that the missionaries had their ethics code is because the grandfather had been a Confederate soldier who was saved by a black guy when he was near death. So anyway, those are just some examples of what the stories are like. This is the Green Book story. Hotel Thelma was in Bluefield, and it's just gotten on the National Register of Historic Places, so they can now restore it. But she was raised, the person telling the story was raised by her great aunt Thelma, and it was also that Hotel Thelma was also on the Chitlin circuit. So people like Ike and Tina Turner, and let's see, this isn't the one that tells me a whole lot of black acts from the early 60s went right through there. And I won't go through her whole story, but, there they are. That's the ones. So James Brown. And the Green Book founder is a cool story too, but she ends up going into TV and becoming one of the first manager of both WMPB in Morgantown and then later WOUB in Ohio. I'll give you one more, I guess. So in chapter, this is chapter 4. Actually, we have to get to Rosemary. We're not going to stop with that. So this is Charlene Marshall, the first black mayor of Morgantown. And as a kid, she was in a coal camp, the Osage one, actually. And her father died in the mines, and her stepfather died in the mines, and many other of her family members. But she ended up working in Morgantown a whole lot for all kinds of people, including babysitting these twins who she just met again after 70 years, and they moved back to Morgantown. But she she and her husband were in cahoots with a couple of women from WVU, and they were integrating restaurants in Morgantown by, well, I won't tell you the whole story, but anyway, it's a very cool one. And she also had a lot of help in people doing things like pretending they were going to run for office, and then after they were elected, they would drop out, and she was the vice president. She got to be head of the whole bowling league for West Virginia, and she also got to be the only black person on the stage at an international bowling tournament with similar things. So those stories are pretty cool. And she became the first mayor of Morgantown who was black and in the whole state, and then she also went on to be in the legislature. And one of the stories she tells that's in the black, or in the bottom area there, is that she was not allowed, she had to sit in the balcony when she was a kid. And then when she was the mayor of Morgantown, the Met Theater was bought by Morgantown, and she got to be the person signing the check. So that was quite a circuit for her. So there's a story about disabilities. And then a story about women, and we have Rosemary's story in there, which I don't have to tell you about because you know it. And a very cool thing, I told you about my class that was enduring me and my social justice stuff, trying to plant seeds, don't know what they'll do later. They might not be a designer, but maybe they'll have a sense of empathy. And one of my students in 1999 was actually the student body president. And I hadn't talked to her for a while, but when I did finally talk to her, it was when Virginia was getting ready to be the last state to ratify the ERA. And she had done the bus wraps and the branding for that whole campaign. And now her daughter is at WVU, and I can tell that she's got the same frame of mind. So that was the VA ratify thing there. So anyway, I'm going to stop and see if you have any questions. Mm-hmm.
It's so generational, capturing the civil rights movement of the 1960s and prior, but also of today. Are there any specific lessons that you think the young folks are carrying from these stories, or lessons that have been lost from the way that we've approached civil rights in the 60s to the way that we do it now? Any themes or trends there?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure, not being a high school teacher, that I know that. I know that my education didn't have very much of that at all. Of course, I wasn't too far away from the civil rights movement, but one of the reasons it's so important not to ban books is because there's so much out there now. If we could get their interest in a graphic novel, then we could get them to read 1619 Project, or so many good ones. We do have one page, and we didn't list that. We didn't list ones we thought would ban us outright right off the bat in our sources, but we do have a list of sources in the back where these came from. But I know when I was in high school, I did not have any idea what Black history was about. It just wasn't in the books. And it wasn't even in the books when I was hired later to do West Virginia history. So I felt cheated. And I think kids aren't going to feel like they're that it's not worth it to get the truth. They're not going to feel as embarrassed as they are to say, well, this can't happen again, this. And I just think we have to point people to resources and to the truth, because right now it's hard to find the truth, because you can find whatever truth you want in whatever silo you want to use, but we have to find places to cross over, which is why. And I guess I'm advertising myself to do workshops, in schools if they're allowed to do it. One of our grantors, the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, is funding 350 copies to go on the west side of Charleston. So we're hoping to see things like that happen. So I didn't answer your question very well, but does anyone else want to answer that question?
Yes, sorry. My generation, so like the very tail end of Gen X, we took things for granted, I feel like, because it was like the 90s and everything, you know? Well, you know, Roe
Yeah.
v. Wade was established, like, you know, people, and then Obama, you know, and then I think the younger kids now, and I think younger people in my generation are like, we can't take these things for granted. We have to keep fighting. And so what I look to the people from the civil rights movement, and I think I have the advantage because I understand the history, but it was a long fight. It was long. And so I think maybe what I look to that is that it's not something that's even close to being over. Like it's just,
It just went underground. It didn't go away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the stuff of the past several years is showing us that you can't take anything for granted. And the fight, you just have to keep going.
Yeah.
And keep
There,
fighting.
there were people in the NAACP student chapter that didn't know anything about the civil rights movement. And like you say, they're taking it for granted because they have white friends and black friends, you know, they have all kinds of friends, but that doesn't account for the discrimination that they're not talking about or that their
But
parents had.
When did, like they went to WVU, right? Were they not taking any history classes? What high schools did they graduate from?
I think it depends on where you
Or
grow
maybe-
up.
Or my husband's a teacher. They could have been taught, but they just weren't listening.
That's true. Oh, they're going to give you a mic.
Well, I think that there's an assumption inside of our larger culture that history doesn't matter. And that doesn't exist in some other cultures. And I think that when people start to recognize that history does matter and it informs deeply about what's going on today, I mean, the deeper lessons, I think, of some of them, of the civil rights movement wasn't that people were fighting. It was because it was about civil disobedience. I mean, that was King's genius, was he said, don't fight back. Don't use the same methods that are used by your adversary to encourage change. Stand there and quietly allow them to be jerks or allow them to threaten you. And it was that experience that was really powerful. And it changed a lot in terms of the way that people thought about the movement, and they saw it as very possible. And I see that happening today. I mean, people are fighting for everything. And I think it would be an interesting phenomenon if people stopped fighting and started to work together or to work for things.
Mm-hmm. There is a big section in the book about the whole nonviolence, like the set of rules are in there. So Joan's chapter is the biggest chapter in the book and does talk about influences of Gandhi and Thoreau and all of that.
I just want to say something a little bit about teaching, but I liked your the visual presentation upstairs. I don't know how hard or difficult or how many roadblocks you would encounter in trying to bring that to high schools or other colleges. I didn't see the whole list. You brought it to Fairmont State College.
Mm-hmm. And it was
I
just
think
at
that's
Marshall.
excellent. It's an excellent beginning to gravitate people to looking.
Yeah, I tried to be careful enough that it wouldn't offend, but you would get the idea.
Right, get the idea. I was going on what you said. I taught Invisible Man at the high school right down the street here. next to Mr. Cassidy's law office. He didn't influence me in any way, but after the first year, I decided that I better do some teaching of African American history, black history. So I started to do my research, also what I knew, but first it blew me away. And then I decided, well, if they're going to even get an idea of what the book's about, and it's more than just about being black, it's about being human in so many ways. Maybe it's not the best book to teach high school kids, but my students gradually liked it, appreciated it. But I gave them 3 days of black history from the beginning all the way till the Civil Rights Act. And tested them on it as a way of hopefully getting it into their deeper memory. Then we had some discussions. And I think, probably they didn't remember anything. I'll have to go back and ask them later on when I see them on the street. But I think that's teachers have to take that kind of responsibility, not just history teachers, because I was an English teacher.
Yeah.
And
When I was doing the Listening for Racial Understanding project and touring that around, I went to Calhoun County, and they invited me to talk to their 6th grade. And I thought, they're going to sleep, they're not going to know anything. When I got there, that teacher had on the wall more people from the freedom movement and civil rights movement that I knew. I mean, there must have been 40 or 50, and they'd all come from reports that the students had done, and they were very well informed. And I was impressed. So I guess it depends on the teacher and what they're willing to do.
and if schools
And the school allowing
if
it.
they're not turned off or
Yeah,
they're defeatist before it begins.
right.
That speaks to a question I had. How did you choose these people? Either find them. It sounds like you have no trouble finding people. But I imagine you had to narrow down your list and make selections. I'm curious how that process was.
And the process was way quicker than I would have preferred. I was racing toward the election. I wanted to get it out before that, and I didn't make it. I got close. My part was done in August. But I just put and having taught for 42 years, I had 700 students, but only 25 were black. And I contacted all of them, and I have been involved with the NAACP in Morgantown. We've had 2 people be delegates that I knew. There's been 3 years they've had Black Policy Day in February, and I set up shop there and put my sign up that I'm looking for stories. So between people I knew and people I could find from those ways, I just did everything I could in 10 months, So the selection was, this is what I had in 10 months. So it's by no means comprehensive, but I did try to get as far as I could within suggestions people gave me. And it just so happened they ended up being from 20 to 100. And 14 counties are the ones you'd probably pick. I wasn't able to get to all the ones from Charlestown, so I got the Eastern Panhandle and the Northern Panhandle, and from McDowell County, got several stories from there. Anybody else have a thought?
I'll go and then I'll bring it over to you. Okay. One of the goals the Walls Foundation had with our Democracy Committee is to actually have people who are on opposite ends now of the political spectrum have a civil discussion face to face, as similar to what you did with white and black people.
Right.
Have you any experience with that sort of active listening? Can it work?
That's what we were trying to do with the listening, well, not with the Designing Across Divides conferences. And I would say we got probably at least people who weren't real right-wing to come, because I invited everybody I could think of that would come. So we did have some discussions, you know, but even though ads were in the paper to come do it, not everyone's going to participate. You know, all the people who already think this way are real ready to do it. But just getting the participation is a trick that we didn't quite pull off. But I'm with you. We need to do that. Like fights or no, we absolutely didn't. And we did. I think we had more success doing things like getting people who are at the donor level and the houseless people to sit at the same table. So that was, I'm sure, enlightening. And we had people, you know, from the police department, like I said, sitting across from folks who they could arrest. So we were trying to get different kinds of divides. But, you know, there's got to be healing after this election, you know, some way or other. So we've got to come up with a way to do it. We did things like we made business cards for everyone that you couldn't put what you did for a living or not having a living, but you could put on there something that you identified with, and I think they were even animals or something. And then you could put on there a lecture you heard that you were inspired by. And so you could get matched up by those, and that would match up people who weren't in the same social circle. So, you know, sideways, we try to do things like that.
My question is, you convincingly described art as being a vehicle towards civil engagement and promoting equality. However, especially now in the 21st century, where art, its access and its creation is practically open to everyone, regardless of their ability or, you know, their ideology.
Through AI, you mean?
AI, internet, and the list goes on. So my question would be, if art is a vehicle towards civil integration, do you also believe that art can work in the opposite effect? And if so, how do we effectively combat that?
You're absolutely right. I mean, we're looking right now at feeds and social media that have come directly from Russia, you know, and we can't tell the difference. I guess teaching visual literacy and trying to find ways that you can identify it is a little something now, but it's going to get more and more sophisticated where you won't be able to even do that. I think we have to teach people literacy in ways that they can find sources to check things out and have the willingness to check things out. Everything is so fast, no one wants to take the time for that. But misinformation is, it's the wedge between ideologies for sure. Anybody else have the answer to that one?
This might be maybe a unique or unusual experience, but I also taught in a private school in the area, and there was not a big black population, and the students that were black in there were pretty much connected to sports events. And when you would have conversations with them about Black History Month, or we worked with some of the people in Wheeling at tutoring centers, they had an interesting response, and their response was, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to sit through a presentation of how awful we had it, and here we are, our naked bodies tortured. I'm done with that. I don't want to be that. I'm okay, you know, I'm doing okay, considerably, and I don't want to go back. Have you ever had an experience like that?
I wouldn't describe it exactly like that, but I do know from working with organizations that we do not need to be putting the responsibility of teaching us on black people. we have to do our own research. We read the books, we do the things, and then we come willing to listen. But, you know, I'm sure those people don't connect to that history as much as they do whatever micro discriminations they're facing, and they're still facing them. There's no way anyone who's black has not been discriminated against. But maybe it's at the level of irritation or just, you know, we just took away the ability to get scholarships because you're black. When I left an endowment for black scholars, and they're not taken away yet, but they are in other states. And, you know, so it's just a different kind of battle now. But there's also such deep poverty because of the generational wealth gap that those students you have probably don't even have anyone they know who's in that situation, but it's all over West Virginia. So I guess we have to be nuanced about it and figure out who we're talking to and what their needs are. Somebody? Oh.
Yeah, I actually spend a lot of my time working at a food and clothing bank and helping down there. And it's been interesting to see the connection between races through poverty. I mean, it's always been there on some level, but there is that interesting interconnection between, you know, experiencing that level of discrimination and social injustice inside this country and being of both races. And I think people do really connect through that.
Yeah, I've heard people say that in another generation we're not going to be talking about race anymore because there's so much blending happening. You know, ever since 1967, there's been a lot of, you know, interracial marriage and multiple races. I mean, some people, you'll look at them and you can say there's a suggestion of something, but you can't tell exactly where they are anymore, and that's just going to be the way we are later. But we need to find a humane way to live now. Where's the mic? Do you want to go grab it?
I feel like we're coming to an end, so I'll ask two kind of, I don't know, less on topic questions. Did you present at any high schools? And also, is your program still at WVU after the liberal arts purge?
Is the program intact at WVU?
Yeah, did it survive the...
It merged with the School of Media.
Okay.
So now it's the College of Media and Design, I think. Or
Okay,
something like that.
hopefully it hangs in there.
It's hung in there, yeah.
And then, yeah, have you presented at any high schools or below universities? And if so,
Not
have you
yet, but
gotten any
mostly
response?
because when I got it done, we were racing for the exhibit to be on July 2nd, which was the actual anniversary of the 60th anniversary, which was the Civil Rights Act anniversary. Got it done for that, but then there was no school in session. And then by the time it came September, I was trying to finish the book. So it hasn't gone to a high school, but if I was invited, it would go. Yeah. Well, the election's almost on us. I'm thinking maybe one black church in Morgantown, and then and we'll all decide what's happening in life November 6th. The Voting Rights Act is the anniversary next year, and I guess that would be a reason to carry it around, perhaps. I had one panel I didn't finish, but I've done it before, and it's on exhibit in the West Virginia State University, and it was a infographic showing the reason the generational wealth gap happened, and it's got like multiple timelines and events that either buoyed you up and that's got a hot air balloon by it, or drug you down and that's got a weight under it. And it went all the way up to 2022 when I was showing that around. But anyway, that was going to take too much research on the part of people helping me to make sure it was all completely accurate. But it had QR codes on it so that, and places to add them so that it could be a teaching tool, and people could add more things as they learned what was going on in those years. So I think, and I was working with the NAACP chapter in Jefferson County doing that, and they were helping with the research. So there's stuff we can do. Do we need to clear out?
To say thank you, and it's a yes.
Thank you for coming.
It's a beautiful exhibit, and congratulations on getting the graphic novel completed.
And there will be free copies to all the libraries in West Virginia that ask for them. So you're getting them for sure.